I think we've reached that point in history where it is not outrageous to claim that pictures and images as means of communication have become just as important as the written and the spoken word. Pictures are absolutely everywhere. We've grown completely used to them as a species, in the way that at some point we've grown completely used to using language, to writing language. In this series of 12 short lectures, I will talk about the philosophy of pictures. And by that I mean philosophical theorizing about what a picture is, as this has happened throughout the history of philosophy. Now, I will focus on a couple of very specific questions and more recent history. But first, what I want to do is talk about what is distinctive of pictures, what unifies the broad family of pictures, because it is a broad family. Think about the following examples. The things you find in a photo album, either on paper or maybe on your computer. The images that you see now when you watch this YouTube video. Think about paintings that you find in an art gallery. Think about the doodles that someone might draw in the margin of an exercise book. All of these are very different in character, in appeal, maybe in value, and in communicative content. But all of them clearly are pictures. Some pictures are still, some pictures move. Some pictures are generated by people, some pictures are generated automatically or mechanically, such as the pictures you take with your camera. What do all of these pictures have in common? Now, the key term here to use is representation, and that is the term that philosophers have used to make this grouping of pictures, because all pictures are representations. But they are representations of a very specific kind. Representation is a hugely broad term, a very broad category of things. Think about politics. So we talk about political representation. We talk about people that represent other people in, say, a political party or a political system. We talk about representations when we do psychology. So psychologists often say that the mind or the brain represents experiences or memories or bits of information. In computer science, we talk about representations. So if you think about a piece of software, it might use representations of certain bits of information of various kind. Perhaps the only thing that unifies all representations is this very general structure. One thing standing for another thing, or one thing somehow pointing to another thing. So we can think that the political leader somehow stands for the people. We can think of the brain state, that it somehow stands for a specific memory. Or we can think of a bit of computer code, that it somehow stands for, I don't know, an entry in your diary or an email. So when we talk about pictures, and when we say that all pictures are representations, we should ask, but what kind of representations are we dealing with? It's clearly not a democratic process by which a picture is generated when you take a picture on your camera, for example. It's also not the case that a picture needs to have some kind of brain structure in order to represent. So maybe what is distinctive of pictures can be answered merely by looking at pictures and understanding how pictures function, how they work. What do they do to represent something? And that is what the philosophy of pictures is primarily interested in. Now, if you look at what people say about pictorial representation, as it is called, the representation that you find in pictures, it still can sound ridiculously abstract. So have a look at what Antonia Phillips and Richard Wollheim write in their article on representation in the link below. So they say that representation in pictures is a relation holding between a picture or three-dimensional object and some other thing, in virtue of which the picture or image is said to be in some special sense of that thing. So Phillips and Wollheim make a lot of this single word, of. In a sense, we can say that pictures are always of something, a picture of a person, a picture of a tree, and that of somehow is a marker of the representational relation. So when we ask about pictorial representation, we're asking about this of structure. A picture is a representation of something, and we can ask quite generally, how is it that this specific picture is of this specific object or person? And that is really the thing we're trying to understand in the philosophy of pictures. Now, there are two interesting things about this seeming relation that we've now identified between the picture on the one hand and the object or person or scene on the other. The object in question need not exist. So I can have a picture of a horse, which is an animal that exists. I can also have a picture of a unicorn, an animal that doesn't exist. So existence doesn't really seem to be a relevant factor in pictorial representation. It doesn't really depend on the existence of its objects. Striking. Another thing is interesting to note. Sometimes we find pictures that are not really of particular things, but more of general classes or kinds or types. Think, for example, of a picture that you can find in an old catalogue of animals with hand-drawn images. Think about the entry of the parrot, a specific kind of bird. You might see a picture of a parrot besides the description of the animal. Now that picture represents a bird, a parrot, but probably not any particular parrot. So what the picture is meant to communicate, meant to show or represent, is merely a bird of a specific kind, not a specific bird. And that is interesting. As we can put it, the range of objects that you can represent in a picture includes the non-existent and the general. What more can we say from the outset about the kind of representation we find in pictures? Well, that it's visual. Pictures present us with a visual form of representation. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. You might think of raised line drawings that could be made for people who are unable to see. These pictures, if we count them as pictures, would represent tactually, by touch. But they represent in very much the same way that hand-drawn visual pictures or photographs even represent. So we might want to include them as pictures as well. But they would be exceptions. In a sense, they are derived from the paradigm case of the visual representation. So it's fair to say that pictures are distinctive for a visual kind of representing. The kind of representation that we find in them is primarily directed at the eyes. And then the important question becomes, how do they do it? So how does a material object, which typically is something like a surface or an illuminated display, come to represent some object, either non-existent, general, particular, for the eyes in a visual way? What needs to happen? Now here we can start understanding that representation often is the product of a process, if not always. Some process leads up to the product of having a representation. If you think about the traditional arts, that is fairly obvious. A painter is at work and she paints the picture. In a sense, what she is doing, apart from just splotching paint on a canvas, is representing someone if she is making a portrait. So the process that we're talking about can itself be conceived of as the process of representation, representing a person by making splotches of paint on a piece of canvas. The product, the painting itself, also is called a representation. What philosophers are interested in when they're asking the question, what is pictorial representation, is the product. So what is that product? What features of that product make it such that it is a representation of something or other? What makes it such that we can say truly that this is a picture of a human individual? So that is the main question that the philosophy of pictures is concerned with. What is distinctive of pictorial representation, understood as a feature or a property of certain artifacts or products that have this very specific feature of being of something or other in this distinctively visual way?